Hi, everybody. I am Brian Diamond, Chair of the Senior Law Committee. I want to welcome you to our very special Veterans Day presentation entitled From Disability to Inclusion, A Marine's Story. This is the story of the history of the disability rights movement here in the United States, as seen through the eyes of someone who was hands-on from the beginning, John Lancaster. We hope it will also inspire all lawyers to believe that a single person can affect change for the betterment of the world with hard work and perseverance. Suffice it to say that John was a native of Hamburg, New York. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1967 from the University of Notre Dame, which John and I both agree was the best university in the world. He returned from the Vietnam War to Notre Dame Law School and obtained his law degree in 1974. You came back to an America that was much different for people in a wheelchair than the one that we know today. Can you tell us what that experience was like for you?
It was not pleasant. You know, I couldn't basically go anywhere. I mean, I could go places through the VA benefits I had. I was able to get an automobile with hand controls, and they actually gave me driving lessons to make sure I could handle everything okay and drive according to with safety, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And but I couldn't get in any buildings. I couldn't use public mass transportation.
So if you wanted to go out to dinner, you weren't able to.
Few places you could get into. There was always the drive-through at McDonald's.
Okay. Tell us about your decision to go to law school.
Well, my father had gone to Notre Dame, and he'd also gone to Notre Dame Law School. So I decided that I wanted to go back and get some degree of some sort. I didn't know what I was going to do. I'd graduated from Notre Dame's general program of liberal studies and had a strong interest in philosophy. So I applied to Notre Dame to work on a PhD in philosophy. After a year of trying to relate Martin Heidegger and phenomenology to classroom pedagogy and the ideas of Dewey, I decided my head was really in the clouds, and it didn't seem to be a big market for philosophy professors. So I jumped to the law school.
Okay. Tell us about that experience of how you came to be admitted at the Notre Dame Law School.
Well, I had an interview. They didn't want to, got into the interview by having, at that time, the law school was totally inaccessible, by having some friends haul me up the steps to get into the building. And there were numerous steps. And in the dean's office, I remember the dean of the school at the time was William Lawless, and the assistant dean was Les Fascio. And they were both from the Buffalo area, and which helped. And because my dad knew the dean, and I know that helped. And then Professor Murphy was also he taught contracts at the time. And they interviewed me, and finally at the end of the interview, Les Fascio said, "John, we understand you want to go to law school here, et cetera, but you don't understand. We're not set up for you, and we literally don't have any seats left in this class." And I told Dean Fascio not to worry about it. I'd bring my own.
Okay.
and that I would arrange to get myself in the building.
Okay. And how did you get in for that first meeting?
Well, I had friends drag me up the steps.
Okay,
step at a time in my wheelchair. So,
okay. When you graduated from law school, can you tell us what your experience was in finding opportunities for legal work in your condition?
it was very, very difficult. I can't tell you the number of interviews that I had where law firms, um, district attorneys' offices. I wanted to be a criminal attorney, and I applied to a lot of DA offices around the country, and in particular in New York State. And the universal response was negative. It was always something like, "We don't think you have the endurance to be a lawyer." It would be something like, "How are you going to deal with the county courthouse steps? They don't have a ground level entrance. You don't understand. Your wheelchair wouldn't fit down in between the stacks of the law books in our law library." I mean, they just would go on and on and on with the excuses. And so I didn't get any of those jobs, never got past the first interview. And I finally applied for a government job in DC with the Board of Veterans Appeals. And at the time, there was no Veterans Court. That has since been developed, but it was the highest level of appeal for veterans who were applying for disability benefits or insurance benefits or whatever they might be applying for under the VA's benefits system.
And what was your task with regard to that?
I was a staff legal advisor to the board, so I would review case files that would come up from us from regional offices of the VA that would lay out the facts, et cetera, and the basis that the person down below had made the determination on to deny whatever the particular benefit was. And on appeal, I would review the case and make a recommendation based on the law and the facts that were in the file as to whether the decision made below was, in my opinion, correct or not correct, and that the veteran should be awarded these benefits. So basically, it was an interesting setup, not to belabor it, but I had a phone on my desk that was nothing but a dictation phone. I talked to that, went down to a tape set up in the basement of the building where they made cassette recordings, picked them up every day, sent them up to Pennsylvania to be transcribed by a secretarial pool. They'd come back to me 2 days later. I would review the case and send it into the edit if necessary, and send it into the law judges. So it was an interesting process. We've come a long way in this age of technology and computers.
I'd say so. But at that time, was there any real disability rights movement that existed in the United States?
No, in fact, after I'd been at the Board of Veterans Appeals, there was one kind of bubbling up among a
Was
few
that the
people.
San Francisco thing you had mentioned to me once?
Yep. Judy Heumann was a big mover and shaker behind it. Veterans organization that I did happen to be a member of. I wasn't an active member, called the Paralyzed Veterans of America, was starting to do some things. And unannounced one day in my office at the Board of Veterans Appeals, these two individuals, Jim May, who was the executive director of the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and the other person, Judy Heumann, who at that time was on a subcommittee of Harrison Williams' Transportation Committee. And her name was, she was a staffer on the the subcommittee was called the Committee on the Handicapped, or the Subcommittee on the Handicapped.
This was in the federal government, is that correct?
Yes, and Senator Harrison Williams was who she worked for on that committee, and those two individuals came barging into my office unannounced, and they're both disabled people. They're both in wheelchairs, and they said, "We heard you're an attorney and that you're in a wheelchair. Can we take you out to lunch?" And it's literally how it happened. And so I went out to lunch with them, and within a week, I gave notice. I was working at the Paralyzed Veterans of America.
Now, tell me about what happened in San Francisco. What was that all about?
They were protesting the lack of any implementation of Title V of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The act had been passed and signed into law by President Nixon, and it am I right there? Yeah. And implementing regulations had never been written on any of this. And
so that was the reason for this protest in San Francisco.
Exactly.
And what did they do with this protest?
Well, they did lots of things. They locked themselves in a federal government building and locked the building from the inside and wouldn't let workers in.
Okay, and this was a protest over architectural barriers in that building?
No, it was more a protest over the general lack of implementation or doing anything about Section 5 of the Rehabilitation Act. Architectural barriers being a big part of that.
Now, was the concept of inclusion of those with disabilities even on the radar back then?
Yes. That's kind of what this fight was all about, or the movement was all about, is the fact that people with all kinds of disabilities, whether they're blind, whether they're deaf, whether they're mobility impaired, intellectually impaired, you can say they're disabled, they're handicapped, they're this, whatever, but it's really society that's disabling us.
How so? What do you mean?
Well, there's no reason I couldn't be an attorney or even a criminal defense attorney like I wanted to be if it weren't for the fact that I couldn't get in the courthouse, that I couldn't do the research necessary, get in the law library, that I couldn't. So I was really, I had the education, I had the knowledge, but I was denied the opportunity by the attitudes of society and the physical layout of literally buildings, street corners, for blind people. It was lack of any way to, without Braille, to consume, written information. You can go on if you think about all the different aspects of how people are affected. So people with disabilities are affected merely by the environment, the built environment, media, all sorts of things. So
you went to work for Paralyzed Veterans. What was your role with them?
My role with them initially was they finally cobbled up a name of their advocacy director. But what they really had me doing was advocating for accessible mass transit up on Capitol Hill.
Tell me about your experience with that.
It was very interesting, going up there, working with other organizations that we were trying to get together to build of movement. For example, there was a organization called, at the time, called the National Spinal Cord Injury Foundation. And they were working on, starting to work on these issues. So we did a number of things, testifying before Congress, finding those senators and Congress people that were amenable to what we were talking about. And Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey was one of those senators, and at the time, pretty powerful. And
you talked, I think, about shutting down transportation systems to get your point across. Was that?
Yes,
can you tell us about that?
In fact, at the time in Washington, the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority had been building the start of the Washington subway system. So they were about ready to open the Red Line with the first 4 stations. So we at PVA said, well, let's get some attorneys. So we went and got some really good attorneys, marched into court and got an injunction that since they hadn't put elevators into any of these stations, which, by the way, we had gotten into the language in the funding bill that was allowing this thing to go forward. So they were basically had blown off Congress's direction. So we marched them into court, got an injunction, and they couldn't open their subway until they made those stations accessible. You've never seen a government act faster in terms of Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority work faster to get some elevators in.
And you did something similar in Philadelphia as well, I understand. Is that right?
Yes, working with the Public Interest Law Center of Philadelphia, PILCOP, and worked with some outstanding attorneys up there, Tom Gilhool, Jim Raggio, and Frank Lasky. And
what was the result of that?
We got SEPTA, Southeastern Pennsylvania Transit Authority, to start putting lifts on buses.
Okay. Now,
and a lot of that fight too was over bus design. You don't have to go and put these big bulky lifts on buses if you just design the bus with a lower floor and have a ramp that shoots out.
Okay.
And that's the way a lot of them are now and should be.
Obviously they weren't then, but you did get a chance about this point in time to try your hand at a criminal practice. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I wanted to get on with legal aid or the public defender's office, but that again didn't work out. So I set up my own practice because they didn't have anywhere near enough defense attorneys in Washington, D.C. at the time. And I'd go down to the local lockup and I'd get assigned a case in the morning. My first client ever happened to be an unfortunate man that had bit the bait on a police woman playing the part of a hooker. And my next 29 cases were actually hookers. So it was an interesting start into a criminal practice. And I did it for a few years and said, woo, I got to make some money here because the court was slashing vouchers like crazy. It wasn't.
You then moved into government work when I believe you started working for the governor of Maryland. Is that correct?
That's correct. I had an opportunity. I was approached by some advocates in Maryland and said, look, the governor's got this position open and he's under the heat from the growing disability community and parents of kids with disabilities in Maryland. And we think you should apply. So so I said, I'll look into it. I did, and I applied, and the governor, interview process and all of that, and the Governor Hughes hired me, and had a great working relationship with him. Really fine governor, good
Can
man.
you tell us what was the state of the federal law at the time with regard to the rights of disabled people?
It basically was built on the Title V of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973. The regulations had finally been signed during the Carter administration by Joseph Califano.
Now,
And
going back to that, you initially, the Carter administration did not want, there was some resistance by him and other politicians to taking down the barriers and entering those regulations. Can you explain why that was?
yeah, bottom line, as it so often is on a lot of things, it was a fear of cost of modifying buildings, cost of modifying transportation systems, cost to employers of that had federal contracts or federal funds for hiring people with disabilities, and have to changes they'd have to make maybe to their workplace. Same with the federal government being scared about changing workplaces in the federal government, and what they would have to do in terms of their buildings. I mean, it went on and on and on.
You
And
had you have an interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You have an interesting story about using your connections from Notre Dame
yes,
that helped to implement those regulations to get the Rehabilitation Act to a point where it could be enforced. Can you tell
yeah,
us that story?
yeah. It was when I was in private practice of law, and my I had heard that Father Hesburgh was coming to Washington, D.C. through
The
the alumni
president of
club.
Notre Dame at that
Yeah,
time.
the president of Notre Dame at that time, and that there was an opportunity to hear him talk through the local alumni club, and that he was in town on other business. He was very involved in the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. He was on the Atomic Energy Commission, I think, at the time too. And so I called up a friend of mine who worked for the university in the development department, John Crow. And John, I asked John, I said, look, can you get me a meeting with Father Hesburgh while he's in town? I want to ask him if he wouldn't. I found out that he's meeting with Califano, and I'm one of the major opposition groups to implementing the regulations, signing off on the regulations that have been developed, were colleges and universities. And if someone like Father Hesburgh could talk to Califano, if I can convince him, maybe then he would sign the regulations. Well, John said, he's staying at the Mayflower. Let me see if I can get you a meeting with him. So John called me back about half hour later and said, he'll meet with you for 15 minutes tomorrow morning over coffee, right before he has to go over and meet with Secretary Califano. So I put the bunch, hurriedly put together an argument and folded it up in an envelope, and took it over there and explained the situation to him over a cup of coffee. And he said, don't worry. And so 2 days later, the regulations were signed.
That's terrific. Okay.
I don't, there was a lot of pressure on Califano from a lot of sources, but I think that was the one that kind of knocked the dominoes.
Tipped it over.
Yeah.
Now, there were, I assume, a lot of people coming back from the military with disabilities as well. Is that correct about that time?
That is very correct.
And there were also lots of parents, you mentioned developmentally disabled individuals who were trying to get help for their children as well. Is that right?
Yeah, and parents of people with mental health issues that were literally being imprisoned in not very nice conditions in a lot of states in these big warehousing type institutions at about 5, 6, 7, 8 times the cost of what it would be to support someone in the community with the right type of supports that they might need to succeed, integrated into the society or with their families.
And during that time, was there kind of a coalition developing among the various organizations seeking to break down the barriers like that for the disabled, or all barriers for the disabled?
Absolutely, Brian, without a doubt. There was a coming together of kind of veterans organizations, disability-specific organizations like National Association of the Blind, American Federation of the Blind, the deaf organizations, a lot of these, some of the parent organizations, like it was then called the Association of Retarded Citizens, the ARC, it's now referred to, United Cerebral Palsy, a whole lot of these organizations starting to coalesce and coming together into a movement to start really making some of these happen. And some of these things happen. And a lot of that happened under the leadership of a lot of really key people like Justin Dart, who I had the honor of working for. And let's see.
Was this the point in time when things started coming around to the Americans with Disabilities Act? Was this kind of the groundswell that led to that? Or
yeah, this is all happening in the 80s. While I was working for Governor Hughes, and things were really heating up and developing. People were working on the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was modeled in some ways after the Title V of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, carrying forward some of the same concepts and then expanding them into other areas beyond just where the federal dollar was. And so it was covering the overall American society at large, irrespective of whether federal funds was flowing there or not. And so it really started to create a true civil rights law and, if you will, movement to support that law. So people were working on the language of the ADA in the mid-'80s. And there were a number of people that I worked with over the years, not just advocates, but in Congress. I mean, two of the biggest champions of the ADA were on the Senate side, Senator Harkin, Lowell Weicker,
Senator Kennedy, I assume, was involved.
Yeah, Kennedy was always there on board, and then Orrin Hatch out in Utah, and there were a number of others too. And on the House side, Tony Quello was a real big leader in terms of making the ADA happen.
What was your role at that time?
I was still working for Governor Hughes, and I convinced him to support the ADA, number one. So a governor being supportive. And then I helped get the Maryland delegation to go along. So we got almost all the Maryland delegation to the Senate and the House voted for it.
And were you and that delegation then participating in the ongoing drafting process and the lobbying efforts that were going on with regard to the ADA at that time?
There were people in Maryland that were definitely doing that. I wasn't. I was involved more in the lobbying end. I wasn't involved in the drafting end. I can't take credit for that. I mean, I would get early, people would send me stuff. What do you think? And I would, respond in that regard. It always looked way better than what we had. So I was generally just supportive, but I was not involved in drafting. There were great people, staffers in particular, in Congress that were doing yeoman's work. One in particular that, Bobby Silverstein, and he worked on, I mentioned his name earlier.
One of the senators or
one of the
congressmen,
senators' staffs.
You talked about your role being primarily lobbying, and I know probably a lot of the people listening to this broadcast or presentation have heard that term 1,000 times, but aren't really sure what that entails. What were you doing?
Well, when I was working for Paralyzed Veterans of America, we called it going up on the hill and waving the bloody shirt. But in reality, we find friendly senator or a friendly congressperson to introduce legislation if we needed it introduced. Often we had initial drafts, or were working with staffers, or had gone up just cold asking for a meeting with, Senator whoever, and Lowell Weicker, for example, and saying we'd like a meeting with you to explain this issue and see if you won't be supportive, maybe introduce some legislation, that sort of thing. So we didn't have budgets, so we weren't taking anybody out to dinner on K Street, and or promising a nice yacht trip in the Bahamas.
Yes, it sounds like lobbying has improved since then too.
We're there with we don't have any money in our pockets. So we have a cause.
Now, eventually, the Congress passed the Americans with Disability Act, and it was signed in 1990. Is that correct? Signed into law.
Correct. Yep.
And
by President Bush.
Okay, and as I understand it, you were there, right?
Yes, I was on the White House lawn. Great honor to have been there, and I eventually, shortly after that, went to work for Justin Dart, who is one of the people up on the dais with President Bush when he signed the law. So,
tell me about your involvement, who Justin was, and your involvement with Justin.
Justin was a tremendous man, often considered the granddad of the ADA, so to speak. He was the one, along with other advocates too, but he was the one who was really the spirit and the tip of the spear, so to speak, behind the movement to get the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. He was a fellow with polio. At the time, he was in, would have been probably in his 60s or very late 50s. And he had used a wheelchair due to the polio he had had as a child. He was a son of a industrialist, kind of political, wealthy man by the name of Justin Dart. He was actually, the Justin I knew was actually junior. And his father had owned a bunch of different companies under the rubric of Dart Industries, including at the time Tupperware and other things.
So what was your role? You mentioned you worked for him. What was your role with
Well,
him?
he had been appointed by President Bush, the first Bush, to be chairman of a federal government agency that existed at the time called the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities. And the purpose of that committee, that was technically under the control of the White House, was to kind of be a marketing and advertising agency for the employability of people with disabilities in the nation's workforce. So Justin's role as chairman of the committee was to manage this large committee of representatives from business and industry, from the labor unions, from the disability community, educators, and, you know, it was a combined, and veterans. I think I'm getting pretty much all the covered groups. And then it had a staff, and then it would do, you know, programs to the extent that we had any money around the country to market the employability of people with disabilities.
And was this after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
No, the President's Committee had been around since the end of World War II.
Okay.
And had not been a very effective agency. Justin Dart started making it effective. He in essence just used it as a platform for convincing people that this is the direction that a country that espoused being inclusive and right from its constitution on, needed to include people with disabilities in all aspects. And it was while Justin was the chair of the ADA that President Bush signed the ADA into law. So,
and what changes did the ADA make from what had been Title V? What from your perspective, were the biggest changes that took place?
It took the necessity for there being a nexus with federal funding out of the picture. So a private company who's opening a new storefront, let's say it's Walgreens opening a new store, they couldn't have any steps into it. They would have to have a means for communicating with customers who might be deaf. They would have, or blind. They would have to allow, you know, anybody with a disability into their store in a way that they could have the experience that the store intended to provide. For example, selling you deodorant or medication for a condition you have or whatever. And so it took the need out of there for there to be federal dollars involved.
So it applied to all private businesses as well. And did you, I think you told me you and Justin went out around the country to give kind of seminars to tell people about this new law, the Americans with Disability Act, and how it affected and changed everything. Is that right?
That's right. We went to all 50 states, not once, but twice. And we'd always go to the capital and to the largest city in the state. Sometimes
who were you talking to in those meetings?
We were talking to business leaders. We were talking to leaders in the disability community and movement. We were talking to labor leaders, and we were talking to government leaders. And
what kind of responses did you get?
Resistance sometimes, but generally just people not being thoughtful, not understanding, and those who got the drift of it all, but dealing with their concerns around cost. What's it mean to my business? What's it mean to the state of Montana in terms of our buildings? What's it mean to all these different things? How does it affect labor unions and the way they operate? There's a lot of interesting aspects to how this would all play out. So we would try to get everybody all in the same room. When we did a lot of these, we used to meet with each group kind of separately, and then we'd get everybody together and try and get them talk to one another. We had some very interesting situations where state vocational rehabilitation folks and the head of whatever a particular state called its voc rehab folks who were preparing people with disabilities to get into work had never even met, for example, the head of the state chamber of commerce, or the biggest city's chamber of commerce, or the head of the National Federation of Independent Businesses in that state. So people weren't even talking to one another. So what we were trying to do, and I think somewhat successfully, was to get those communities in the same room talking about the issue of getting people with disabilities jobs, getting them included in the broader base of things, and included in the workaday world.
Now, you mentioned that President Bush had asked you to serve as the chairman of the Agency for Employment of the Disabled, and then there was a changeover to the Clinton administration, and that committee wound up under the auspices of Congressman Tony Coelho. Is that correct?
Correct.
And tell us about that experience where you got to learn about how politics works in the real world.
Yeah, I actually that was very interesting. I learned a lot of things about how politics worked in the real world back then. I don't know if any of you remember, but that Tony Coelho had been kind of run out of Congress because people claimed that he was too close to Mike Milliken and his junk bonds. And it was true that Tony did buy some of those junk bonds. I think he got taken a little bit himself, and he was a friend of his at the time. But Tony was acquitted of all of that, but Tony stayed involved, and he himself was an individual with disabilities. He had been disabled when he was a teenager on the family farm when he rolled a pickup truck off a irrigation dike, kind of separating fields and that, and he had gotten traumatic epilepsy.
Tell me about what he told you about killing the organization to save it, kind of a thing.
Right. And then when he hired me, because Clinton had appointed Tony as head of the president's committee, as the chairperson, and so Tony wanted to hire me to be the executive director, that staff person. And Tony knew how I felt about the agency. I said, look, if we couldn't make any significant progress in terms of employing people with disabilities under Justin Dart, how do you think we're going to do it now on this little, $2.5 million, $3 million budget, what we had. And he says, well, first we're going to build the agency up so it has some decent programs. We'll double, triple the budget, maybe more. And then we're going to kill the agency and create a assistant secretaryship over at the Department of Labor and give it some real staff, some real money, and some real clout. And
That's what happened.
and that's exactly what we did.
And I just wanted to say, I, for one, am left with the impression that your heroics only got more impressive when you left the battlefield and came home from the war. You saved soldiers on the battlefield, but you also helped to save a generation of disabled Americans through your generous work. And I want to thank you for your outstanding service to our country in so many more ways than just the military. And I also want to wish you a very happy Veterans Day. And this will end our presentation. Thank you, John.
Well, Brian, thank you. And thank you to the DuPage County Bar Association for inviting me and for, getting the information out there.
You have a great story to tell. Thank you very much.
And it's a great field of law, by the way, for any young lawyers.
Well, that's right. That's right. Disability rights, civil rights. So,
yep.
Okay. Thanks, John.